Welcome to Devotionary, where we make the Bible accessible and applicable. If you had to write a song expressing your views of God, what would it say? If you had to write a poem describing your understanding of who God is and how He's worked in your life, would it be filled with words of flattery or frustration? It would probably depend on your most recent experience with God. If in your mind He had been good to you, you would probably sing His praises. But if things had not turned out quite like you wanted them to, you might be a little less than positive in your assessment of Him. But in 2 Samuel 22, verses 17 through 31, we continue to see the words David penned immediately after he had been delivered from the hand of Saul. Let's face it, at that particular moment in his life, David had a lot he could have complained about. But rather than whine and moan, David glorified God and declared that His way is perfect. Pretty amazing when you consider all the things that had happened to him on his way to the throne. This section of David's psalm contains an interesting contrast. In it we'll see David continue to exalt his God while at the same time seemingly praising himself for his own blamelessness, guiltlessness, and righteousness. At first blush, it would appear that David is bragging about something he has no right to claim. Even if this psalm was written in the early days of his reign, immediately after the fall of Saul, David was far from a sinless man. And yet he claims, "The Lord rewarded me for doing right. He restored me because of my innocence." 2 Samuel 22, verse 21. But wait, there's more. "I have kept the ways of the Lord. I have not turned from my God to follow evil." 2 Samuel 22, verse 22. And then he audaciously claims, "I am blameless before God. I have kept myself from sin." 2 Samuel 22, verse 24. What's going on here? Is David delusional or simply suffering from an overactive sense of self-worth? One of the things we have to remember is that this passage is virtually identical to Psalm 18, written in the early days of David's reign. This chapter opened with the descriptor, "David spoke to the Lord the words of this song on the day when the Lord delivered him from the hand of all of his enemies and from the hand of Saul." So this is very early on in his career as king. So context is critical to understanding what David is either saying or claiming. When we read the word blameless, we tend to interpret it as meaning sinless, but it's a word that speaks of integrity of heart or wholeness of character. David was simply saying that he was rescued by God because he had done nothing to deserve God's displeasure or punishment. David's suffering under the hand of Saul had not been due to his own sinfulness. He had been the innocent victim of Saul's anger and jealousy against him. When this psalm had originally been written, David had been coming out of years of living as a fugitive, under constant threat of losing his life because of Saul's hatred for him. And when David writes, "The Lord rewarded me for doing right, He has seen my innocence," 2 Samuel 22, verse 25, he's simply acknowledging that he had done nothing to deserve his suffering. He had been given 2 opportunities to take Saul's life, and had refused to do so, out of respect for the Lord's anointed. He had feared God more than he had despised his own circumstances. So David had a clear conscience before God. But this psalm is less about David than it is about God. It's an acknowledgement that God was all-knowing and fully aware of the circumstances surrounding David's life. David's suffering had not been the result of his own sin, but the divine will of a sovereign, all-powerful God. He had seen David's plight and heard his cries, and he had responded. He had rescued. He had shown himself faithful to David because David had remained faithful to him. He had responded to David with integrity because David had shown himself to be a man of integrity. Not all the time, not every moment of his life, but within the particular context in which this psalm was originally written. What makes this psalm so interesting is its placement at the close of 2 Samuel and at the end of David's life. It had been written early on in his life, but reappears here when David's reign was coming to an end. It reflects a reality that David had experienced in his life, but that had not been true every moment of his life. We know of his sin with Bathsheba. We're well aware of the murder of Uriah. We've read about his many faults and failings. David was not always a man of integrity. He didn't always do the right thing or react in the proper manner. He didn't always seek God or rely on Him for help. Sometimes he took matters into his own hands. But David did know that in principle, God rescues the humble, rewards the righteous, and restores the innocent. But David's point in all of this was to exalt God, not himself. He was simply trying to state an indisputable reality when it comes to God's relationship with men. He doesn't reward the wicked. He doesn't smile down on the prideful. He refuses to forgive the sins of the wicked as long as they remain unrepentant and self-reliant. David states God's way is perfect. All the Lord's promises prove true. He is a shield for all who look to him for protection. That had been David's experience. He had seen it proven true in his own life. At no point along the way could David point his finger at God and accuse him of dealing falsely or faithlessly with him. God's way was perfect, even when David's way was not. God had always dealt faithfully with David, and we have seen that to have been the case all along the way as his life story is unfolded before us. Even when David had sinned, God had dealt with him lovingly and faithfully. God had repeatedly rescued and restored him. Yes, David had suffered for his sins. He had been forced to endure the consequences of his disobedience to God. But nowhere along the way had God proven unfaithful, unloving, or unwilling to keep his promises to David. His ways are perfect. All his promises prove true. He is there when we seek for him, but he's also there when we fail to recognize or rely upon him. David may have left God on occasion, but God had never left David.